Hi class, it's Dr. Lindner. In this video, we're going to be introducing the digestive tract. And I'll probably mention, as we're going along, some gastrointestinal tract disorders to kind of whet your appetites and keep it somewhat interesting. So when we talk about digestion, digestion is the process through which the body's going to break down large, complex foods into their constituent building blocks or their components, building blocks, in order to facilitate absorption and assimilation of those nutrients and to bring them into the tissues and the cells. So when we break down proteins, proteins are broken down catabolically into amino acids. And triglycerides are going to be digested and catabolized and broken down into glycerol and 3 fatty acids. And then the complex carbohydrates, such as starch and glycogen, these are going to be digested and broken down into glucose. So when we look here on top at carbohydrates and fats, and proteins, the carbohydrates, we think of sugars, that's going to be broken down into glucose. Now, what's going to happen with that glucose? Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. So this 6, see if I could draw it for you. This 6-carbon sugar, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that 6-carbon sugar is then split, which we call glycolysis. Lysis means to split, or glycolysis, and it's broken down into 2 3-carbon sugars. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, into 3-carbon sugars. We just call it pyruvate. Then pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA, and that can enter the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is going to make some ATP. The glycolysis will make some ATP, not too much, a little ATP from glycolysis, little ATP from the Krebs cycle, but the majority of the ATP is going to be produced by what's called the electron transport chain. The ETC, electron transport chain. Now, fats are broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. The glycerol part is going to take the root of the sugars, okay, and the fatty acids are broken down through what's called beta oxidation into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA can enter the Krebs cycle for energy production, some ATP, not lots, some ATP, but the Krebs cycle is making what's called coenzymes that are needed for the electron transport chain. And those enzymes, or those coenzymes, are called, it's going to be NADH, and another one, FADH. FADH. And this is why we need B vitamins. We need B1, B2, and B3. So we need B1 to B3. The N, that's from niacin. And the F is flavin, like from riboflavin, which is B2. So niacin is B1. I'm sorry, niacin is B3, and riboflavin is B2. And then we have amino acids. And so proteins are broken down to amino acids, and amino acids can kind of go into all 3 of these. Amino acids can be broken down and become sugar. It can go right into acetyl-CoA, and they can enter right into the Krebs cycle. So the reason why we consume food that's made up of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats is essentially to break them down. And when we break them down, the body can create ATP. And the steps of glycolysis is taking place in the cell, but in the cytosol of the cell, whereas the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, these steps are taking place in the mitochondria. Okay, and that's where the majority of ATP is produced, primarily because of this, the electron transport chain. That's really dependent on iron and CoQ10 or coenzyme Q10. It's really important. So there's like a critical thinking point, what can happen if you're iron deficient or you're anemia? What type of symptoms does that person experience? Well, if someone's anemic, we could say they experience fatigue. Now you understand why there's fatigue, because the electron transport chain that makes ATP is dependent on iron. What about people who take statin drugs? Simvastatin, Arvastatin. Statins are anti-lipidemic medications or anti-cholesterol medications, and statins block a very important enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase that's required to produce cholesterol. But in the same pathway of making cholesterol, the body also makes coenzyme Q10, which is needed by the electron transport chain to make energy. So now this helps explain the adverse reactions to many of these cholesterol medications, which is myalgia and arthralgia and neuralgia. Algia means pain. Myalgia, you've heard of fibromyalgia, it's muscle pains. That's because the mitochondria are highly concentrated in muscles, and if you don't produce ATP, the muscles are going to be crying in pain. That's myalgia. Okay, so the purpose and evolutionary advantages of human digestive system. If you think about it, we can practically travel all around the globe, different parts of this world, and consume foods from all over. The process of digestion allows humans to consume a wide variety of foods and inhabit many areas of the earth. We can adapt to just about any type of food. For the most part, when you can't adapt or the body is rejecting something, we would call that a food allergy. Not necessarily that something is wrong, but for some reason that particular individual shouldn't be consuming that type of protein, that type of foreign protein to the body. It rejects it for whatever reason. So food allergies occur when the immune system kind of absorbs these partially digested proteins and it responds and reacts to it. And the body can make antibodies, IgE or even IgG. Some of these antibodies are produced immediately. These are IgEs, and some of them can have a delayed onset response, 4 or 5 days later, IgGs. So you can consume something right away and get itchy ears, itchy skin, rash, hives, and your body will produce antibodies immediately. Those are the IgEs. But you can eat something on Monday that can give you a headache on Friday. And that's part of this delayed antibody response, IgGs. So some of the symptoms of allergies they're pretty diverse. You can get a rash, you can get hives, you can get headaches, dizziness, nausea, decreased ability to learn, decreased memory, hyperactivity. In fact, if you just look at these, this can be commonly mistaken as ADD or ADHD. There could be an anaphylactic shock where the tongue swells, the throat closes up. There could be dilated pupils. Oftentimes in my patients, especially children, when I see dilated pupils, it's often indicative of a dairy allergy. And I'll say, did you have milk today? No, I didn't have milk today. Oh, what did you eat today? Oh, I had yogurt. Okay, it's in the dairy family. Shiners, which is like the darkness under the eyes, that could be an indication. You can get atopic dermatitis or rhinitis. You can get congestion in the nose, you can get rashes on the skin, dry skin, irritations, all signs of food allergies. Let's take a look at the primary parts of the digestive tract, just so that when we go through them in this lecture, in this video, and I'll make several of them. I'll probably have one video on just the mouth, one just on the teeth, one on the esophagus, one on the stomach, one on the liver, one on the gallbladder. You know, I'll break them up into smaller bits. So where does digestion begin? When we think about digestion, it could be mechanical, it could be chemical, right? The teeth, we know, can mechanically break down food, but we have a lot of digestive enzymes that break down food. So when we think about digestion, most people would say, well, it starts in the mouth, but again, critical thinking, we could take it a step above and think of Pavlov, the experiment with the dog, where they ring a bell and the dog comes out and then the dog eats. And then they ring a bell and the dog comes out and the dog eats. And they're conditioning, right? The animal. They ring a bell, the dog comes out, the dog sees the food and starts eating. And they do this several times. Then one day they ring the bell, the dog comes out, is salivating, but there's no food. So where does digestion begin? It's really in your mind, it's in your thoughts. You can think of grandma's soup, grandma's chicken, and you could start salivating, or, you know, your mom or dad's favorite dessert to cook. So you think of eating disorders. Many eating disorders are not a problem with the mouth, it's a problem in the brain. A lot of eating disorders take place in the hypothalamus, where the signals aren't getting there that the person is full. So they keep eating large amounts until that center is stimulated, and then they feel full, right? So everyone has different sensitivities to that. But yes, I would agree, from a physical standpoint, putting food in the mouth, you have the teeth that would break down food. You have these salivary enzymes, whether it be the parotid gland or under the tongue, sublingual gland, or under the mandible, the submandibular gland. So these are the salivary glands. You have the tongue for taste and for movement to manipulate the food around. We have lips to bring in the food. So these are very important in the digestive process. A lot of digestive disorders can take place if you're not producing enough digestive enzymes in the mouth, or if the teeth aren't aligned properly, or they're not touching properly. You can't break down the food well enough, and you're supposed to chew your food long enough so that you can no longer identify what's in your mouth before swallowing it. Okay, then we have the esophagus. The esophagus is this long tube here that leads into the stomach. And then the stomach leads into the small intestine that has 3 parts to it that we can see here. The small intestine is broken down into the first part, the duodenum or duodenum, then the jejunum, and then the final part called the ileum. After the ileum leads into this part here of the colon or the large intestine. That's called the cecum. And then we have the colon or the large intestine that is divided into different parts. We have a ascending colon. We have a transverse colon running transversely. Then we have a descending colon. Then we have a sigmoid colon. Then we have the rectum and the anal canal leading out to the anus. Here's our vermiform appendix right here. We have accessory organs as well. The accessory or secondary organs are going to be the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, and these salivary glands. Those are all like secondary um, digestive organs or accessory organs. Okay, so those are the main parts of the GI tract. And then if we look at this and we look at those parts, we can see what each portion is responsible for, right? So the mouth here is responsible for ingesting the food, right? And in the mouth, we take in the food, there's chewing, there is some digestive enzymes that are taking place in here, both some chemical and mechanical, mostly mechanical. In terms of chemical, you're not breaking down proteins and fats in the mouth. We have an enzyme here to break down just starch. Okay, then the food goes down into the pharynx, into the esophagus. And what's happening here in the esophagus is what we call propulsion, where the food is moving down through smooth muscle contractions called peristalsis. And then the food enters into the stomach, where we have mostly chemical digestion. Now, there is some mechanical digestion, because when we go over the stomach, we'll see that the stomach does have a few layers of muscles, which can make the stomach kind of contract and churn and mix some of the gastric juices here in the stomach a little bit. But for the most part, it's chemical digestion that takes place. Then we move into the small intestine, which is where the majority of your absorption of nutrients take place. Your water-soluble vitamins and water-soluble foods going into blood vessels, and that your fat-soluble enters the lymph through the lacteals, the lymphatic vessels. Okay, that's for fats. And then what's left after the body absorbs everything, now there's going to be some waste to eliminate. And in the large intestine is where the stool or the feces is formed, and water absorption, right? If there's too much water in the colon, then you're going to have loose stools or diarrhea. So in the colon, there is water reabsorption back into circulation. And then what's left is the formed feces to allow elimination or defecation. So within the gastrointestinal tract, there's chemical digestion, which is the catabolic breakdown. Catabolism is breaking down, anabolism is building up. So chemical digestion is catabolic. We then absorb. Absorption is the movement of nutrients from the gastrointestinal tract into the blood or lymph. In the blood is where the water-soluble nutrients go, and in the lymph vessels is where the fat-soluble substances move. And then there's defecation, which is elimination of the undigestible solid wastes. Through defecation, it allows detoxification, and it also allows for the removal of cholesterol. Years ago, I remember I had a woman that came to my office, and she had high cholesterol, it was over 500. And that was being on cholesterol medication. Now, the first question I asked her, the very first question was, when was your last bowel movement? And she thought to herself, and she said, today's Friday. I said, yes. And she started counting. She said 5 days. And I said, is that normal for you? She goes, yeah, about every 5 days, that's normal. So what that's telling me is that if her body is not eliminating the toxins or eliminating the cholesterol, her skin and her complexion was not very good because she was not eliminating toxins from her body. It was trying to come out from the skin. And her cholesterol, if she had some fiber in her diet, it would help the bowel movements. And if she increased the fiber and was able to eliminate properly, that would have lowered her cholesterol. As soon as we got her on a cleaner diet and restored her bowel movements, her cholesterol dropped to under 200 very, very quickly. So when food enters the mouth and we chew and swallow, that's called degglutination. The food in the mouth is not food anymore, but it's called a bolus. The bolus is the food that's chomped and broken down by the teeth with all of its digestive enzymes. So we can see the food is in the mouth, and now it's moving down. And what I want you to see is look at here, look at this epiglottis, right? When the food is moving down, it has two options, right? It can go down the esophagus, which is what we want, or it can go down the windpipe, the trachea, which we don't want. So to prevent the food from entering the windpipe, this epiglottis has to fold downward to close it off. And that's what happens right here. You can see the epiglottis closes off the trachea, which helps to divert the food right down the esophagus. We see the, I shouldn't say food, the bolus. So we see the bolus moving down the esophagus. Here it is. We have these peristaltic waves, these contractions known as peristalsis. The bolus is still moving all the way down. It has to make it through right here, known as the gastroesophageal sphincter. This gastroesophageal sphincter opens up so that the contents can now enter the stomach. Sometimes the gastroesophageal sphincter is also known as the cardiac sphincter, and that's because that's where the apex of the heart kind of sits. And that's why a lot of people experience, they'll if they have indigestion, they'll say heartburn, because it's kind of where the location of the heart is. Okay, and now the bolus is entering into the stomach because that gastroesophageal sphincter is relaxing, opening up, allowing the bolus to enter the stomach, at which time we now refer to those contents as something called chyme. Chyme. Now, if in the stomach, there's lots of acid, right? We have hydrochloric acid. And that's acidic, right? It's a low pH, 2.3 about pH. If this gastroesophageal sphincter doesn't close and it remains open, as the stomach is churning and breaking down the food, there could be the splashing of acids up into the lower esophagus. And that's what creates, they call it gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. So we don't want these acids splashing up because you could really damage the epithelium of the lower esophagus. Things that can weaken that sphincter is obesity, chocolate, too much coffee. They can really weaken and damage this, okay? So again, just an overview. We see the bolus here in the mouth, right? The teeth have chewed and chomped and broken down the foods, plus the digestive enzymes, breaking it down. The food, the bolus is going down, closing off the epiglottis. Food, the bolus is now into the esophagus. It's moving down with peristaltic contractions. The bolus is now squeezing its way through that cardiac sphincter, AKA gastroesophageal sphincter, and now it's in the stomach, called chyme. The human body is designed as a tube within a tube. And we'll talk about the different layers of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, the serosa, the muscularis, the submucosa, and mucosa are the main layers. Now, I'm going to talk about this in the next video. So let me stop here. When I come back, here's a little trailer. We'll talk about these layers of the GI tract and how important it is.